Hey, this is Charles with Rocky Mountain ATV MC. Today you're watching part 3 of our engine rebuild series for the KTM 690 and Husky 701 bottom end rebuild. Now, if you're not to this point, go back in the series and you're going to want to pull the motor from the frame and tear down that top end. So for now, let's get started. Back over to the other side of the engine, I'm going to pull this drip pan out and we're going to start removing some of these components from this side. So I'm going to start out with the oil filter that's on top. Next, I'll remove the flywheel cover and loosen these bolts up in a crisscross pattern. And some of these bolts are going to be different sizes, so pay attention to which bolts go where in the cover. And now we can remove the cover. Now to remove the flywheel, we're going to use a flywheel holding tool. But I'm also going to be wiping off any excess oil on the outer diameter of the flywheel. Then we can set the tool in place and tighten it down. Now I do want to point out, you can see we've got our pickup sensor right here. Make sure this tool doesn't come in contact with that and damage it. Now we can take our 27mm wrench and loosen the flywheel nut. And we'll remove this tool. Next, we'll take our tusk flywheel puller and remove the rotor. We're also going to be using a little bit of grease on this. Now when you use this tool, you want to make sure the center bolt is backed out all the way, and you rotate this outer piece on until it's fully seated on its own by hand. And then we'll apply some grease to these threads on the center bolt. And we can hold the center piece still and tighten the center bolt down until the flywheel pops off. So when you pull this off, you want to locate that woodruff key. Make sure you don't lose this. Next, we're going to remove our timing chain guides. So we'll remove both of these bolts. And then to remove the timing chain guides, they actually slide into this back piece. So I'm just going to pull it forward and start sliding it up, and that releases it from the bottom piece. I'll do the same thing for the other one. The next step is to remove this cam chain. So if you're going to reuse it, it's a good idea. You want to wipe off some oil from one of these links and mark the outside. And that way it gets installed the same way it was before. You can also use a paint pen to do that. Keep in mind that if you use solvent on this cam chain, that it's probably going to wash that mark off. So just pay attention to what orientation it's in. We're going to remove this woodruff key. So to do that, you can use a punch, and you just want to knock one corner down, and that'll raise the other side up. After that, we can remove the snap ring for the cam chain sprocket. The next step is to remove the lower cam chain sprocket. We're going to use a 2-jaw puller for that. You can use the KTM special tool or a commercially available 2-jaw puller like this. And all you're going to do is set the 2 hooks behind the gear. You'll center this bolt in the middle, and we're actually applying a little bit of grease to the tip of that as well as on the threads. And we'll tighten the center bolt down until that sprocket comes off all the way. And we'll remove the gear. Make sure you note the orientation of the gear. That way you can put it back on the same way, as long as it's not damaged. And just take note that you have that woodruff key in there. We're going to remove that as well. I'm going to pull this off as much as I can by hand. You can use this gasket scraper to help remove the gasket, especially where that glue is. Then we'll remove these two bolts. This rubber grommet, this has some silicone sealant on it, so you might have to pull on that just a little bit to get it out. After that, we'll remove our dowel pins and our gear position sensor. Don't forget the O-ring. And now we'll take some channel locks and remove the collar from our counter shaft. There's also an O-ring behind that collar that we'll remove. And we're also going to remove our drain bolt and oil screen on this side. We also need to loosen up two bolts on this side. So one of them is going to be a 10mm head socket, and then the other one will take a 6mm Allen socket. We're just going to loosen them up, and we'll be removing them at a later step once the case half is apart. Now on the right side of the engine, I'm going to remove our oil filter and our oil screen. The next step is to remove our water pump cover. So there's going to be 5 bolts on this. The next step is to remove our water pump impeller. So we're going to remove this bolt, and on the back side on the crankshaft we're going to hold that using our 13mm wrench, and we can crack this loose. Okay, now this impeller was on here pretty tight. It just took a little bit of rocking back and forth to get it off. Once you have this off, don't forget you're going to have this special washer right behind it. And since we're here, I'm going to pull this gasket off as best as I can. If some of it stays on, that's fine. The next step is to remove the clutch cover. So to do that, we're going to loosen our bolts in a crisscross pattern. And as we take them out, you want to stay organized because there will be some different lengths. So you can lay them out in order using a piece of cardboard and just drawing the cover and put each bolt in the correct position. Now with all the bolts out, we can remove the cover, and just like any of the other covers, keep an eye out for these dowel pins. And we'll see if we can get this gasket off in one piece. Now that the cover's off, we're going to remove this clutch. To do that, we're going to install the 4 special bolts into it. And these bolts just need to seat lightly. The next step is to remove the 4 bolts from the pressure plate. So to hold the clutch from rotating, I'm just going to use our gear jammer in between the primary drive gear and our clutch basket. And I'll just loosen all these bolts up evenly in a crisscross pattern. And I'll go ahead and remove the spring, washer, and bolt for each spot. Next, we'll remove the pressure plate. We also have the lifter right behind it. All right, the next step, we need to move these locking tabs away from our clutch nut. So I'm going to use a chisel and a punch to do that. Now, we already have our gear jammer in place, so we're just going to want to leave it there, make sure it's in the correct spot, and then we'll break the clutch hub nut loose. Now, as I remove this hub nut, I want to point out that you want to replace this special washer with a new one on reassembly. All right, now you'll notice that the nut on the primary drive gear is reverse thread. It says left, right on it. So we'll leave the gear jammer in place and we'll loosen this one up. Next, we can remove our gear jammer. And now we're going to remove our clutch hub. It's going to remove all the clutch plates with it. Make sure you keep an eye out for the spacer on the back, and then you have 2 half moon retaining clips. You're going to want to remove both of those as well. Now we can remove the clutch basket, and as we slide this out, be really careful with it. You have a couple of needle bearings back in here. You also have a washer on the back. The next step is to install our primary gear puller, and I'm applying some grease to these threads. And this is just going to screw onto that primary gear. We'll hold the puller still with our wrench, and then we're going to tighten down the center bolt with a socket until this primary gear pops off. Now once that's popped loose, we'll remove the gear. After that, we can remove these starter gears. So we have this idler gear up top. We're going to remove the snap ring. With our snap ring pliers, there's going to be a washer behind it. So pay attention to that. After that, we have the torque limiting gear. So again, we have the snap ring that we need to remove. So on this one, you can see we have the needle bushing, and then on the other side, we also have this washer that can come out. So keep track of those. And then you can remove the freewheeling gear. And once you've done that, you're going to remove this woodruff key and these needle bearings. Next, we'll remove this plunger and spring. To remove the shift shaft, you're going to push down on the sliding plate so it's away from the shift drum locator. And remember, on the shift shaft, you can see this washer is kind of sticking. It came off, but if it sticks, make sure you take that off with it. The next step is to take a screwdriver, and I'm going to push down on this locking arm, and we're going to remove this bolt on the shift drum locator. Once we've removed the shift drum locator, we can release the tension on the locking lever. Then we can remove the bolt and locking lever. Next, we have 2 oil pump drive gears. So on these gears, we have a circlip on the end and a washer underneath. So to remove this style of circlip, or this one's actually an E-clip, I'm going to use a small flat blade screwdriver and pop the clip up. I'm going to keep my thumb on one end of it so it doesn't fly off. So keep track of that and this washer. Then we'll remove the oil pump drive gear. Watch out for this pin, you don't want to lose this. There's also one more washer on the back side. We'll go ahead and do the same thing with the other drive gear. And again, when you're removing these parts, make sure you keep everything organized and keep the matching parts together. The next step is to remove the oil pump covers. So these two bolts up top, these are a T25 on ours. And now we can remove the cover. Once you have the cover off, you can remove the shaft for the inner rotor, and then we'll remove the outer rotor. Now we'll remove the cover for the other oil pump with our 3mm Allen wrench. Again, once we have the cover off, we'll remove the oil pump shaft with the inner rotor. And when you take these out, just keep in mind there is a pin on the back side of that shaft. Make sure you don't lose that. And then we'll remove the outer rotor. With the left side of the engine facing up, what we can do now is remove this nut or retainer for our engine stand, and then we're going to loosen all these 8mm head bolts in a crisscross pattern until they're all out. Now as I remove this bolt that is all the way in the oil filter cavity, you'll notice there's a copper washer down in there that needs to be removed as well. As we remove these bolts, it's the same thing as any of the other covers. Make sure you keep track of which bolts go where, because there will be different sizes. The next thing we're going to do is split the case halves. So to do that, you will need a crankcase splitter. You always want to use the correct tool for the job. If you don't use this, you could possibly damage something. So with this tool, I've greased the threads, and then what I'm going to do is set this middle portion over the end of the crankshaft. And I've already backed this center bolt all the way out. And then you want the arms in 3 fairly even positions, so you make a Y. Once you've done that, we'll use the supplied bolts in each location to hold this in place. Now, one last thing, I just want to point out that all of these arms are evenly supported on this case half where that stator cover goes. Now at this point, we'll make sure we're perfectly centered on that crankshaft, and then we'll tighten the center bolt down until these case halves start to split. And just be cautious, if you're really cranking it down, then you may have forgotten a fastener. So check your work, it shouldn't take too much force. As you can see, our case half took a little bit of force to get it apart, and a common place for these cases to stick is on this back side. There's a collar that goes all the way through, and if that's not coming apart, if you have a little bit of tension on this and the front half is starting to come up, sometimes you can gently tap this with a mallet and it's going to help that other side break free. Once you have everything freed up, the case half should slide off fairly easy. There might be a couple washers that have come off, so you can see this one came off of that main shaft. Then we do have this collar on the counter shaft that stayed in place. The balancer shaft, there's going to be a washer on the end of that, or a shim that actually stayed in place. So just keep track of those things, and we'll set the other case half on the workbench. Next, we're going to remove the 3 dowel pins that should be in this case half. So you have 2 up top and 1 right in the middle right here. And towards the front of the engine, we have an O-ring that we need to remove. The next step, you can see we have timing marks on our crankshaft and our balancer shaft. Just keep that in mind for reassembly. So at this point, what I'm gonna do, I'm just moving the crankshaft far enough that I can remove the counterbalancer. And with that out of the way, we can remove the crankshaft. Moving on to the transmission, we have this pin going through these shift forks. So I'm gonna remove that first. It has a little bit of tension on it since our motor is at an angle. Once you've taken that out, you can slide the shift forks to the side and remove the shift drum. After you've done that, remove the shift forks, keep these in order. Once you're to this point, there is a clip on the other side of this counter shaft. We need to remove that circlip. And don't forget the washer right behind that clip. Now we can remove the transmission shafts. To do that, I'm gonna push on the shafts from one side and hold them with my other hand and carry these out. Now you can see I left a couple gears behind, so when you pull these out, there's gonna be washers behind them. So make sure you keep track of everything, lay it out in order on the correct shaft. So this one has a needle bearing, the last gear, and this last gear is also gonna have a washer on it. Now that we have the transmission shafts out, we're gonna start removing the seals from both case halves. And anytime you have this engine apart, you're gonna wanna replace all of the seals. So we'll go ahead and I'm gonna use a rag just to prevent damage to the case half, and then use a seal puller and remove these seals. For the water pump seals, we're gonna drive them out from the backside using a socket. You can also use a bearing and seal driver, either one, but we're gonna flip the case over and set it on some wooden blocks to support it to do that. And when you drive these out, you wanna pay attention to their orientation. So this was our water pump seal. This side is facing out. This is that oil seal. This side was facing out and this side's facing in. So just make note of how this sits in there. Now moving on to the bearings. For most situations, you're gonna be replacing the transmission bearings, your crankshaft bearings, and counterbalancer bearings anytime you have these case halves apart. But for those really rare situations where maybe you have a low mileage bike and you're in here maybe for a transmission issue, getting that fixed, we'll show you how to inspect one of these bearings, and that procedure should apply to most of the other bearings. So you want to start out with a clean bearing. Make sure you don't have any debris in there. So we'll spray that out with some contact cleaner. We're also going to dry it off with some compressed air. And when you dry these bearings off with compressed air, you want to hold the bearing from spinning. You'll use some engine oil or light lubricating oil. Just spray it onto the bearing. And then you'll take your finger on this inner race. You want to make sure the bearing rolls freely and smooth. You also want to check for play in the bearing side to side and up and down. And if you can feel play in there, you're going to want to replace it. Now, for this style of bearing with these rollers, the inner race is actually pressed onto the crankshaft. So you want to inspect the race on that crankshaft, check for any grooves or damage, and then these rollers, you're checking for any flat spots, pitting, or if you see any signs of excessive wear. And if that happens, you want to replace them. But again, almost always when you're in here, especially with these crankshaft bearings, you will be replacing them. Now the bearings that are a little less common that you'd have to replace are these shift drum bearings. They don't see a lot of action, so make sure those rotate freely. There's no play in them. And then we have these roller bearings for our shift shaft coming all the way through. And again, it's the same thing. You're just checking the rollers for pitting, flat spots, or any signs of excessive wear. So at this point, since we are replacing our bearings, what we're going to do is clean all this residual oil in here up with some contact cleaner. And once we do that, we can start driving the bearings out. And we're not worrying about these gasket surfaces yet. We'll clean those up in a later step. Now at this point, we're going to be replacing all of our bearings except for the bearing for our shift shaft seal. This one's looking pretty good, but we did find the shift drum bearing. There are a couple spots where it's kind of notchy, so we will be replacing those as well. To remove the bearings, we have to take out these retaining screws. Now before you heat these bolts up, you want to make sure that any residual oil or contact cleaner is cleaned up and the surface is completely dry and clean. Now I do want to point out that these bolts can be stubborn, so if the impact driver or the heat doesn't work for you in getting these out, what we've had to do on a couple of them is take our auto centering punch and we're just going to make a mark on the side. Then we're actually going to use our punch and hammer and we can knock the head of this bolt loose. So that just barely knocked loose. It did take quite a bit of force, especially for how small that bolt is. I'm really surprised it took that much force, but this works. All right, now on the other side of the case half, I'm gonna remove this bolt. That's an oil passageway. Remove the sealing washer as well. And then right here, we're gonna have a spring and a plunger. We're gonna wanna pull both of those out. Anytime you're replacing your other crank bearings, you're going to want to remove this inner race and install the new one. So that's what we need to do next. And when you do this, KTM does make a special tool to hold this crankshaft in the vise, but we realize a lot of you guys aren't going to have that. So what we're going to do is we're going to clamp down on the old race in the vise, but we're just going to clamp really gently, and it might be helpful to have a friend hold this crankshaft while you remove the bearing. And I do want to point out, on our vise, we do have soft jaws, and again, we're just clamping down really light. Next, we'll take our inner race bearing removal tool. We're going to set it on the hot plate, and the manual wants you to get this to 302 degrees. Now that we have the tool hot, I'm wearing some thick gloves, so when I grab this thing, and then also I'm going to have a friend hold the crank in place so it doesn't move while I pull everything off. Then after that, we can remove the shim right behind it, just using a magnet to pull that off. There's actually 2 shims on this one. Keep that in mind when you go back together. And then we need to pull this gear off. So for this gear, we're just using 6mm by 1.0 thread pitch. 2 of those bolts to screw in there and just tighten them down. It's going to pull that gear off. And I've got my special tool on the hot plate again, getting warm while I pull this off, and that way it's going to be ready for the other side. All right, the next step is to remove the bearings from the case half, and the service manual will tell you to heat this case half in an oven to 302 degrees and then slam it against a wooden surface, and then all the bearings are going to fall out. But we realize that a lot of you are not going to want to put this part in your oven. So what we're going to do is just use a heat gun. We'll heat this case up. So we'll get it nice and warm, and we're going to be using some bearing drivers, and we'll drive all of these out. Next, I'm going to take the inner race that was on the crankshaft, and I'll slide that into the correct bearing where it went. And I'm going to use a bearing driver on top of that to push that bearing out. Next, we'll remove the main shaft and counter shaft bearings. Again, we're going to heat the case up. For the counter shaft bearing, we're going to have to install that inner race for it. Next is the counterbalancer bearing, and we're going to remove this bearing with a blind side bearing puller, and I'm going to have somebody help hold the case. Keep in mind that the edges of the case are really sharp, so we're using some rags so we don't cut ourselves. And we'll do the same thing for our shift drum bearing. Now I do want to point out that it was pretty hard to fit our blind side bearing puller down into the shift drum bearing. So if that's the case with you and you can't get it to work, again, you can always heat this up enough to where you can hit it against a wooden table and then all the bearings are going to come out. Now we'll take some similar steps to knock all of these bearings out of the other side, except again, we are using the roller bearing for the shift shaft. Moving on, we'll remove the seal in the clutch cover. Now we're going to clean up our covers and case halves using some contact cleaners, some rags, a little bit of Scotch-Brite, and some gasket scrapers. And if there's any minor damage on this case half on the sealing surface, you can use a fine file to clean that up. We're also going to clean all of the threads up in the case halves using a thread chaser. And again, we're going to make sure that all the oil passageways are free and clear. So we're going to spray through all of the oil jets. If you had any signs of a lack of lubrication, you definitely want to remove these oil jets and spray everything out, including the jet, to make sure there's nothing in there causing a restriction. All right, for us, we just want to make sure that everything is free and clear. So we're going to go ahead and remove the oil jets. I'm also going to remove this oil gallery bolt that's on top. Then we'll flip our other case half over. Then we'll remove this oil jet with a flat blade screwdriver. And we're also going to remove the cover plate for the oil return line. Now with all those pieces removed, we'll spray through all of those passageways. Now that we have the crankcase halves cleaned up, you need to inspect them for any damage. So the common areas that we'll inspect are these bearing surfaces where our outer race will ride in the case. If this has any galling on it, or you can see that that outer race on the bearing was spinning inside of here, then chances are you're going to have to replace this crankcase half. The other thing that can happen is you can get cracks in the case. Now, there's a difference between casting marks and cracks, so you want to make sure that if you see something weird, it actually is a crack. If you have that or any serious damage to the sealing surface, then you're going to need to replace it. Now we're going to move on to inspecting the crankshaft, and to do that, I want to make sure that all these machine surfaces are really clean, using contact cleaner and a rag. And if you had any oil baked on there, you might be able to use a little Scotch-Brite to help clean that up. All right, now moving on to the crankshaft inspection. We're gonna check our connecting rod big end bearing. Now we showed you how to inspect this during the top end disassembly, but we're gonna show you some basic checks. And if your crank passes those basic checks, you can move on to the next step. But if you suspect that you had a problem with this crankshaft, we're gonna show you a couple more in-depth checks to make to this as well. So we'll start out by checking the up and down play in the connecting rod big end bearing. Now with the connecting rod, you should be able to slide it side to side in this, and you don't want to confuse the rocking motion of this with up and down play. So what I like to do is slide the connecting rod to one side and I'll pull straight up and down on it. If you feel any play, you're going to need to either rebuild this or replace the crankshaft as an assembly. So there's one check that's quick and easy to do. The second check that just about anybody can do is with a feeler gauge. So our spec is 0.3 to 0.6 millimeters side clearance on the connecting rod in between there and the crankshaft web. So again, with the connecting rod to one side, we'll insert a feeler gauge and you're gonna slide these in until you can't. So the biggest one we can get in here, this one is a 0.4 millimeter. So we are well within spec and our big end bearing is good. Now the other inspection you need to make on the connecting rod is the small end. So as you can see, our small end does have a little bit of discoloration right in the middle, but if I run my fingernail through here, it does not catch on anything. So our connecting rod would be good to reuse. But again, if you had any pitting or galling that your fingernail does catch on, then you want to get the connecting rod replaced. Now for the more in-depth checks, the manual is going to want you to have a crankshaft truing stand and 2 dial indicators, but more realistically, more people will have some V-blocks and 1 dial indicator. So that's what we're going to use to inspect this. Now, again, for the big end bearing, if you're not sure if it's bad or not, one check you can do is set the crankshaft in the V-blocks, and then you're going to set up your dial indicator, and you'll want to zero the dial indicator out. So I'm going to hold the crankshaft at a 90-degree angle, and all we want to do is try and move this up and down. So I've got almost 1/1000th of an inch of free play in here. If I lift this up and down, the service limit is 2/1000ths of an inch. If that passed inspection and maybe you thought your crankshaft was out of true, what you're going to do is this machine surface on the end of the crankshaft, you'll move the dial indicator over to that. And then any surface that will have metal to metal contact, will spray a little bit of penetrating oil on that. So all we're looking for now is we want to get the maximum movement of our needle as we rotate the crankshaft, and you want to keep everything perfectly still. So we're just going to smoothly rotate this, and I'm holding on to the connecting rod as well. Now, as you guys can see, we had just over 3/1000ths of an inch run out on our crankshaft. So this is actually within spec, but it's a little more than I would like to see. Obviously, ideally, you'd have 0 run out, but that would be a super rare occasion. So with this, the service limit is just under 4/1000ths of an inch. If you exceeded that service limit, then you definitely need to get it trued. And if you had a bad connecting rod or connecting rod bearings, you do have an option to replace the whole crankshaft. So on the website, you can get either just the crankshaft rebuild kit or the complete assembly. Now moving on to the transmission, we're going to inspect these parts for any issues. Now with these, before you start taking these apart, you want to do a preliminary inspection, and if these transmission shafts pass the preliminary inspection, you can move on and you don't have to disassemble these any further. But if you do notice any problems when you're doing your inspection, we do have a specific video just for transmissions. You're going to want to refer to that to get whatever problems you see replaced or repaired. So with the transmission shafts, we have our main shaft and our counter shaft. So on these, what we're going to have is we have freewheeling gears. So this one on the very end, this is a freewheeling gear. You want to make sure that it spins freely and smoothly and that there's no up and down play in it. Obviously it's going to rock side to side just a little bit, but if you're going up and down, you don't want any play in that. Moving on, the next gear in. This one is a sliding gear. So you want to make sure that this slides freely and can engage with the gears that are next to it. So moving up one more, we have another freewheeling gear. That one's feeling good. Next to that, we have another freewheeling gear. And then one more down, we have another sliding gear. And this one slides freely. It's working good. And towards the very end, we have another freewheeling gear. That one feels good as well. Now on the main shaft, the first gear, this is going to be a fixed gear. So in a later step, we're going to inspect these teeth. We'll move on to the next gear, which is a freewheeling gear. And this one feels good. Next one is a sliding gear. This has 2 gears on it. And that's working correctly. Next we have another freewheeling gear. Feels good. And last, a fixed gear. So all of that's working correctly. The next step, we need to check the teeth. So we have straight cut teeth and then we have gear dogs. So the straight cut teeth, you want to check for any chipping, pitting, or any visible damage to these teeth. If you see any damage on this, then you need to replace the matching gear on the other shaft. So go through and check all of those gears. And then on these other gears, I'll just pull this off just to better show the process. These tabs on the end of the gear are your gear dogs, and this is how they look when they're in good condition. Now, a common issue with these is that one side of these gear dogs will wear down, and if this happens, it's likely that your bike will jump out of gear. So definitely want to inspect for that, and also inspect the corresponding gear to make sure that the slots have a nice square edge and that it's not rounded off in there as well. Next, we're going to inspect our shift drum and our shift forks. So with these forks, if your transmission was jumping out of gear, then it is possible for these forks to get bent. If they're bent, a lot of times you'll see some wear at the bottom of this U shape. If you have wear right here, then you're probably going to see a little bit of galling on the side of this gear as well. So definitely check for that. Now, if the shift forks don't look bent, you just want to inspect these pads on the end. Our manual actually is not giving us a thickness measurement, but you just want to check for any visual signs of damage and make sure they fit good into the matching gear. Now, other than that, you want to inspect these pins on the end, make sure that they're completely round. And we have this shaft that the shift forks ride on. You want to inspect the shaft for any deep grooves. If there's no deep grooves, you also want to inspect it to make sure it's not bent. And to do that, I'm just going to slide a shift fork down it. If the fork binds at any point, then you know that this shaft is bent. Now, moving on to the shift drum, you're going to inspect where the pins on the shift fork ride. Now, if you see any damage here, most likely you're going to see these high spots. They'll get rounded off and flattened out. So if you don't see any damage there, then you're going to be able to reuse the shift drum. Now, with the shifting mechanism, the checks are going to be fairly obvious. We have 4 different springs. We just want to make sure the springs aren't broken. So one right here on the sliding plate, here, and on the shifting arm. So ours are looking good. You want to make sure that the sliding plate moves freely, these corners aren't rounded off, and then also on the shift drum locator, make sure these pins going through, that there's no visible damage on those. And then this star section on here, make sure none of these star tips, you don't want any of those rounded off. Other than that, these 690s, they do have a tendency to hit false neutrals. That can be fixed by changing the shift arm. So if you want to do something about that, you can get an aftermarket shift arm. Now, for the oil pumps, the checks will be the same. And all we're going to do, we have our outer rotor. I'm going to set that in place, the inner rotor. And what we're going to do, the service limit is going to be 0.2 millimeters or 0.008 of an inch. I cannot fit that in there. I'll measure this just to show you guys what you need to do. You need to find the clearance between the case half and that rotor. So it looks like we're about 4/1000ths of an inch on the outside. And then we also need to check the clearance between this inner rotor and our outer rotor. So I'm gonna set this so the lowest point is on one end, the highest point is at this other hump. I'm gonna check that clearance right there. So I'm gonna jump down to the 3.5 feeler gauge, and that one slides in there with just a little bit of resistance, so we know that's where we're at. So this one's looking good. You'll inspect the second oil pump in the same way. And another thing, you want to inspect these plastic gears, make sure none of the teeth are damaged. And then we have just these little pins that drive the gears for both this inner rotor and the plastic gear. Make sure these pins are in good condition and that there's no damage to this shaft that the rotor or plastic gear rides on. Last thing with the oil pumps, you want to inspect this cover that goes over the oil pump. Make sure there's no damage to that, as well as if you remove these rotors from the engine case, you want to make sure there's no damage to the case half right here. Moving on to the timing components, we're going to check out our cam chain. Now with this, what we want to do is make sure that none of the links bind up. So if you move the chain up and down, make sure they all move freely. And if they bind up and you straighten the chain out, and if you've got some links that are still bound, then you know this timing chain is bad and needs to be replaced. The other thing, if any of these side plates look like they're broken or cracked, obviously you're going to want to replace it as well. Now with the timing chain sprockets, if this timing chain had a bunch of kinks in it and you need to replace it because of that, then you definitely want to replace these timing gears as well. So on this one, really we're just checking for a uniform pattern throughout the teeth, no really sharp edges, no broken teeth. There's no visible damage to ours, so we're going to reuse this. We'll do the same inspections to the bottom cam chain sprocket. Next, we're going to check the cam chain guides. You're just checking for any deep grooves or if the plastic is actually cracked on any of these three pieces. So you can see on this chain guide, we actually do have a little bit of a mark right here. If that is very deep, you definitely want to get this piece replaced. And the last thing is to make sure the woodruff key is in good condition. Now for the clutch inspection, we're going to be inspecting the bearing in the pressure cap. Rotate it, make sure it rolls freely, and then you also want to check it for any up and down play or side to side. And it's probably hard to see on camera, but this bearing does have just a little bit of play in it, so we're going to replace it. Next, we're going to inspect this push rod, and how you check this is by rolling it on a flat surface and making sure that it's not bent. So ours is perfectly smooth. Looks good, so we will reuse that. Once you've done that, you can measure these clutch springs, make sure they're still within spec. So minimum spec on this is 31.5 millimeters. So we're at 32.85, so we're within spec. We'll go ahead and do the same thing to the remaining springs. 33. So all of those are good. We can move on to inspecting some of these other parts. So over here we have some roller bearings, and it's the same as any of the other bearings we've inspected. You can see this one's been a little hot at one point. Some of those rollers look a little blue. You want to check for any flat spots or pitting. So on this one we are going to be replacing it. And then these other parts, you'll want to check them for any obvious signs of damage. This washer, you want to replace it every time you're in here. Now moving on to the clutch basket, a couple of common checks on this. Right where all the clutch plates ride on these fingers, you want to run your finger down there, make sure there's no deep grooves. So the grooves, you want them less than 20/1000ths of an inch. So if you have anything that's significant at all, then you're going to want to replace the clutch basket. So this one is actually looking pretty good. So we can reuse this. And on the back, We have 2 gears. Just make sure the teeth are in good condition and make sure they're securely attached to the clutch basket. If you have a ton of slop or play in here, then you're going to want to replace this. Now for the clutch pack itself, I'm going to start taking that apart. So I'm going to remove our special tool, or these bolts. So we're going to go through all of these clutch plates and check for any bluing on the steel plates, and we'll measure the thickness of each fiber plate. And as I remove these plates, I'm laying them all out in order. The steel plates have a sharp side and a rounded side, so you want to make sure you reinstall everything the way it came off. Now I do want to point out on this outer clutch hub that once we had it cleaned up, you can see some marks on the surface where those clutch plates ride, but it's nothing that catches my fingernail. It's just little discoloration. So we're going to reuse this. Now the other thing with this, if I flip it over, we have an arrow right here. So that arrow needs to match up with this notch in that inner hub. So when you slide these together, they're going to line up just like that. So keep that in mind when you're assembling both of these together. So at this point, we want to put oil on all of the clutch plates and this judder spring as well. So judder spring, concave side is facing down. Then we have this different plate that's going to go on first, larger inside diameter. Make sure it sits over that judder spring. And then we're going to alternate plates. So we have a steel plate going on, then a friction disc, and then we'll alternate until all of the plates are installed. And one more thing that I want to point out is the very first friction disc, it was offset from the other discs, and I'm going to try to keep all of these tabs lined up as I work up. We're going to take this arrow, make sure the arrow lines up with that notch. And as I'm sliding everything into place, you want to check, make sure these springs pop into those grooves. And then I'm going to kind of hold everything, all the clutch plates in place while I drop these screws into place, or our special tool. So at this point, everything is still lined up, and I'm just going to apply some steady pressure with both hands, and that way the clutch plates stay lined up and I can start our special tool. Once you've done this, you want to do one final inspection. If there's any gaps in here, then that means this clutch pack is not assembled right. So you want to make sure it's nice and tight, just like this one. And that's it for the bottom end disassembly and inspection for the LC4 690 engine. If you need any of these parts, check out the OEM diagrams on our website. We offer free shipping on orders over $75. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, because you're going to find other helpful content like the rest of this rebuild series on there. So follow us over to the next video to learn how to reassemble your bottom end. I'm Charles. Thanks for watching.